Hi, I'm Kathryn Lopez from National Review, and I'm here with Grazie Christie, who has become a regular here on our YouTube here on the National Review Institute. Gracie's based in Florida. She's a medical doctor, and today we're talking on the third anniversary of the Dobbs decision that ended Roe versus Wade. And my fake background here is from the oral argument day, where both Gracie and I were speakers at the rally outside the court. And maybe that's a good place to start, because I do remember that morning being such a morning of hope. And I know 3 years later, after the decision, a lot of people don't know what to make of the decision. Was it too soon? Everything seems so chaotic. Abortion numbers are going up in the United States overall. Of course, rates are going down in states where now we're free to make regulations to help save human life. So maybe, Gracie, go back to that morning and talk a little bit about why this is still a good thing that Roe versus Wade ended.
Yeah, we have a sense of, I feel like 3 years out, we have a sense like we failed in a sense. like we finally, David slew Goliath, and 3 years later, we're still mired in the same war.
Right.
And things look a little worse on many levels.
Yeah.
So why is it a good thing? It's still a wonderful thing that Roe v. Wade died, that Goliath was slain, because Roe v. Wade was a blanket provision across the United States that made it impossible to defend children and women and
right.
families and fathers. It made it impossible. So the fact that Roe v. Wade is gone is a fresh start for America. It's a fresh start for our culture. But we have to, we have to take it with a lot of faith and a supernatural outlook, right? Like God doesn't hand us things on silver platters. We were able to slay Goliath, but the work is still at hand, and the work has changed. It's a different kind of work. So we can't expect things to suddenly become easy, but we can expect that even though things are different, right is on our side. We are still correct. We are correct that the dignity of a human life has to be placed right in the center of society. It has to be like the root and the source and the pinnacle of all our endeavors, and that dignity of human life, whether at the very beginning, in the middle, or in the end, if our society needs to reflect that. And maybe the battle ahead of us looks different. The forces that we're facing look different. They look more, they're more diffuse, and they're I think that what was great about Goliath is that Goliath was just this one big guy, right? You knew where he was standing. You knew where you could find him. You knew what arms he carried. And now, instead of one Goliath, it's like to use a different metaphor, we cut off the head of the Hydra, right? And the Hydra sprouted 7 heads. Well, we are, a lot of us Christians, or just people of good conscience that care about human dignity, and we are in the struggle. And we wake up every morning and we pick up our arms and we go out and cut off more Hydra heads. But we got to do it. There's no other way. And we have to do it with a lot of confidence in knowledge that we are correct, that what we want is good for everybody in society, not just for us or in our own little circles, but to uphold the dignity of human life is good for everyone. It's good for the marginalized of all kinds. It's good for the migrant. It's good for the poor. It's good for the rich. It's good for whites, blacks, and everyone in between, and other shades, whatever. There is no section of society that does not benefit from us fighting the battle to uphold dignity of human life.
And even if you're not a person of faith, or even if you don't know what to make of the word dignity when it comes to human life, or others would use, or in other contexts, sanctity, all you have to do is look at Roe versus Wade and look at the fact that it was bad history and bad law and bad science and the lies that were in that Supreme Court decision that was inflicted on the United States, that they're gone is a good thing. And it is a reset. And it is an opportunity for us to actually have the debate that the Supreme Court took away from us, essentially. And so yeah, of course it's a hot mess, and of course you have one situation in Texas and you have another situation in New York, and you have a battle between New York and California to see who can have more abortions and who can be the bigger tourist destination for abortion and all this sick reality. But we also have the opportunity, yes, to protect lives in Texas and Louisiana, and name your favorite state. And we have the opportunity. One of the blessings, so much of, and we'll get into some specifics of this in a little bit, but some of the reality of post-Roe America includes complete lies in the media. And I'll give some of the reporters the benefit of the doubt. Yes, it's a hot mess. It's very confusing. So maybe some are not outright lying, but I do think others are outright lying. And it's so dangerous, not just because it's confusing people and it's adding to the hostility and the tension and the anxiety and the confusion. It's leading to lawyers and doctors making decisions that are just wrong, morally, wrong legally,
medically.
Wrong medically. Mm-hmm. And it must drive, I know it drives me crazy, it must drive you even crazier as a medical doctor when you hear these crazy stories where supposedly a woman with sepsis can't be treated, or a woman with cancer can't be treated because she's pregnant. No, there's no pro-life law. My understanding is there's no law in America that has resulted from the end of Roe versus Wade that would say that if you're sick and you're pregnant, you can't be treated. But because of so many of the lies that are out there about what's been going on, there are doctors and lawyers and hospitals making the wrong call.
Mm-hmm. Here in Florida, we've had that problem, and the Department of Health of Florida, the Board of Medicine, they've issued very specific instructions so that those things won't happen. But as you say, there's so much misinformation being promoted on the media. I mean, if you spend 7 minutes on Twitter or on X, you hear the most outrageous things, like women are dying because they're in the middle of a terrible miscarriage and no one will intervene.
Right.
And it's simply not true.
And if it's happening, it shouldn't be happening.
When it is happening, it's a grave miscalculation and a misadministration of medical care.
Well, and we just heard that story in Florida about the member of Congress who was having an ectopic pregnancy, mm-hmm. and because she knew actually what was going on, she could advocate for herself, but there were medical officials who thought they couldn't treat her.
Exactly. Even though Florida is a state which has issued, I mean, I'm a radiologist and I've received several notifications from the state. The state knows I'm a radiologist. They know I'm not performing abortions or treating ectopic pregnancies or anything in between. I've received detailed instructions on how care for ectopic pregnancies is not abortion, which any doctor in the history of mankind could tell you that. Mm. It's a problem. It's that confusion, which I think it has been mostly sown by media that is not friendly to the dignity of life. But in England, in the UK, they're sadly going through this process of decriminalizing abortion through birth, and it's made me think on another positive side of Roe v. Wade is that because Roe v. Wade existed, we had a very sturdy and fervent culture war over abortion. And that's not something that we've seen in Europe. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been easier in the UK, for instance, to, decriminalize abortion through birth, because there's no organic back and forth like we have in the United States. So, and I bring that up because even though the back and forth can get really messy and we can have these horrible, confusing situations like this, how do you treat an ectopic, which should be clear, now it's not somehow. That vigorous back and forth also creates space for people to get passionate and be informed, and then and hopefully not go down terrible paths where suddenly, a baby who could survive very easily outside the womb if the mother just hung on a couple more weeks, is instead destroyed.
Right. And we were talking before we hit record about this awful case we've talked about before, of Adriana Smith, the woman in Georgia who whose baby has now been delivered, I think about a week and a half ago now, as we're speaking, baby Chance. And you engaged on it a little bit on social media and saw some of the darkest of social media in response.
Yeah, it's very shocking. When you see the depth of the anger, and the darkness, the darkness in the mind of the very, very pro-abortion activist side of this culture war. Because there's a real anger that the mother was kept alive as an incubator. They call her an incubator, that it's some sort of Frankenstein thing, and the baby's, it's terrible that she was kept alive, or not kept alive, I'm sorry, kept on enough support. She was brain dead, but kept on enough support that the baby could live. And it makes me very sad for these people, because the reflex is towards death. Basically, reflex, we are told, we've been told for thousands of years, choose life that you might live, right? You have the choice before you. You have death and you have life. Choose life that you might live. And there is this dark side of our culture war that is very definitively choosing death. And we're seeing it in different options. I mean, in different scenarios, right? Of course, at the end of life, or for the disabled, your own home state of New York, contemplating assisted suicide as, a great solution to to spending too much on end of life. Well, there's your suicide. Maybe this is less expensive. But there's a darkness there, and it's the darkness of nihilism. It's the darkness of death as the best option, and it makes you very sad for people who feel that way reflexively. Because you see it coming from some terrible deep hurt, that they do not see the life of a child as something like inherently a blessing.
And I think on top of that, you mentioned, Gracie, the culture wars we've been engaged in. And I do believe, and I do think it's a mix of hurt, because of life circumstances, awful things that have happened in one's life, and also sort of in the conventional media hearing the worst about the pro-life side. And I do think there are people who really believe that we look at women as incubators, as
well, the handmaid, right? When they want to. Right. When they want to make fun of us, they bring out the red costumes.
Right. Meanwhile, one of the handmaids is a Supreme Court justice, and Amy Coney Barrett, right? Or go down the line, you're a radiologist, part of the opportunity, I think, in post-Roe America is for us to tell our story better. And of course, it's challenging because the media is what it is. But on the other hand, there are so many different sources now of media, and so many ways to be creative and so many ways to encounter people. And I'm kind of like a broken record now. I'm just like, do the people in your life know that I mean, in your life, yes, I know a little bit about your life. People know that they can come to you for help. But very often we've talked about this before, among pro-lifers, people in our lives probably think we're the first people who would judge them. So whatever we can do to counter that, to know instinctively that people may think that about us, that we're showing love in such a way that can't be true of us. And
We
so,
have to be part of the big solution, right?
right,
Like, well, even talking at the other end of life, right? Um, I think there's something to be said for a lot to be said for being the person that visits the sick.
yeah.
You know somebody in your life who's homebound. When was the last time you passed by with a pastry and sat for an hour with that lonely person?
Right.
So we have to be active. Pope Francis said you have to smell of the sheep,
Right.
right? Which is such a pretty metaphor. Yeah, we have to smell of the sheep, and that has to be. We have to have that in unity of life,
Right.
so that what we say and what we believe and what we're active about vocally and is reflected in our entire lives as well.
Well, and there are a number of us, speaking of visiting the sick in the New York area, who know Dovie Eisner, who wrote against the assisted suicide bill in New York. He himself is severely disabled, and so he wrote for Unheard, and then the New York Post picked up his piece, basically making the argument that because he's disabled, the law, if passed, would be targeting him.
Mm-hmm.
Then unfortunately he's just as the New York Post picked up his piece, his breathing tube detached, and we don't know for how long, but he's been in a coma ever since. So I think we're going on, it's been over a month, maybe it's approaching a month and a half now. And I bring him up, first of all because he wrote very powerfully, um, but whenever anyone goes to visit him, I know this was my experience. I walked into his hospital room, and his family, he converted to Catholicism, but his family are Hasidic Jews, and his dad is by his bedside, singing psalms in Hebrew, and we have no idea if he knows what we're saying, if we know, if he knows what's going on. But it doesn't matter because he's a human life, and he's still Dovey, and we're going to love him. And his parents in particular are just such a beautiful example of love and sacrifice, and thanks be to God that he has advocates, because if he was just in some, and he's also in a Jewish hospital in Brooklyn, if he was just in some secular hospital, who knows if he would still be alive. um, but just an example of reminding ourselves that it's not life life's value is not about utilitarian values, or it's a precious gift for as long as it's gifted to us, and we're still praying for his healing, and we don't know how this story is going to end, but even on a hospital bed, he's a witness to the value of human life, and why choosing assisted suicide is so deadly on so many levels. And we saw just the other day, you mentioned Britain, Gracie. I was on a train, going up to the Shrine of the North American Martyrs, actually here in New York, which is so relevant in so many ways. A site of the clash between life and death and good and evil. But so I was on the train as the House of Commons was debating. It was only a 2-hour debate. It was only about a 2-hour train ride. They had a 2-hour debate about assisted suicide, legalizing assisted suicide in Britain. Insane. But it was unbelievable. I mean, we should not be shocked by these things, but I guess it's good we're still shocked. there's one member who was bringing up actual cases of actual human beings who were killed because they had eating disorders,
And that
eating
shocked me.
disorders.
That shocked me too. I've
Yes.
I've known a lot of sweet teenage girls with anorexia.
And
And
apparently they should have been killed instead of treated. And
it's
it's just, but the callousness or indifference or combination of both, where members would say, well, that happens, but we're going to do this anyway. What?
well, but Kathryn, I looking at all that, it's made me think that, and it's also this made me, and also I was thinking the same thoughts during the Supreme Court case on the transgender Skermeti that we won, thankfully, but or that was won, thankfully. But it made me think the at in the center of all this is a moral question. Is suicide a moral act? Is chemically castrating a child a moral act? Right? Are these things that can possibly be done by a good society? And if you miss that one spot, right, then all you're doing is you're talking in circles about how you're talking about details, right? It's like, like, can you exterminate people in death camps? Well, if you're gonna slide, if you're gonna slide over that little point, the moral issue, then you're just going to be talking about how do you arrange your dormitories, or which of the people, are you're going to admit to your death camp. So you're doing details. And that's what I was thinking during the oral arguments in England, in Parliament on they're just talking about the details. And in Skermeti also, there was a sense of talking about the details, right? Like, could the state do this? Oh no, but it doesn't violate the Equal Protection Clause. Like, they were talking about the details.
Right.
We need to get back to morals and say, are certain things just beyond the pale?
Could this ever be good?
Is there a place
giving a child a puberty blocker, putting the child through some kind of surgery? Could that ever be a good? No, it can never be good.
It can never be good. Like, when do we address the moral issue of, is this something we ought to do?
Right
there, just leave it at that. Should we do this? Not how should we do it, or to who should we do it? Right. That's basically what the Parliament was arguing about. How should we do it? What kind of people shouldn't we do it to? And what kind of guardrails should we build around the procedure? I felt like they had already accepted that suicide is in itself unacceptable. Yeah, of course, they must believe that, because in a very liberal society, the idea is that everyone ought to do whatever the heck they want all the time. And if suicide is what you want that day, then you should.
My body, my choice.
My body, my choice. So we go back to the great disaster of abortion. If you've been living in a culture where abortion is legal for decades, you have to accept suicide. You have to. Right. You've been trained.
Right.
Generations of people have been trained to say, I decide.
Right.
So that's just, it's all you choose. Okay, here we go back. Life or death?
Right.
Well, darn it, I choose death.
But like with abortion, with assisted suicide, this idea of choice is a lie in many cases. How many women you encounter, because I know you do a lot of volunteer work at pregnancy resource centers, how many women, girls feel like they have no choice, that abortion is their only choice? And same with end of life situations, where we create a medical culture where it's expedient, financially and otherwise, to just get rid of the patients rather than going through years of treatments. And so every elderly person,
we create a culture where being disabled or very sick is a sentence for loneliness and marginalization. Like, we don't have a welcoming culture for the sick and the disabled, and on many levels.
And going back to that continuum that you were talking about, I may have mentioned this to you already. A couple of weeks ago, there was a panel in New York where a doctor from Columbia Presbyterian was speaking, and she talked about how all her medical trainees now, especially since the Dobbs decision, ask her, so these are our future doctors and nurses, why do we have any stigma against suicide? And she wrote, which is
a great question. It's a very good question.
It is a very good question. And she also said that she was recently giving a talk on assisted suicide, and a young woman, in all seriousness, raised her hand and said, we have an epidemic of loneliness. You just mentioned loneliness. Wouldn't assisted suicide be a good solution to loneliness? Mm-hmm. She wasn't trying to make some satirical point. She was asking an honest question. That's where we are now. One positive thing I want to say, going back to that Georgia case, first of all, there's a little boy who's alive today, and thanks be to God for the doctors and for I think that Adriana Smith, the mother, I think her parents were very used by abortion ideologues, and they clearly, in interviews, they clearly wanted to see their grandson. They're heartbroken about their daughter. It's just such a terrible situation. And yeah, there were advocates of abortion who really wanted to make them some kind of poster family, and they just want to love their grandson, and care for their other grandson, because she already had a young boy. And but one thing I noticed after Chance was delivered was there was a new trend on social media in some circles where I saw a lot of mothers saying, just for the record, if I were ever in the situation where I were pregnant and something happened and I was pronounced brain dead, please, if there's any possibility for the child to survive, I want the child to survive. Like, let this be the record. Use this as my advance directive. Because what mother doesn't want to do whatever humanly possible to protect her child, right? And so we can't make assumptions, obviously, about someone who can't speak for herself. But we also know what motherhood is, and anyway, thanks be to God for mothers and for sacrifice. And I just urge people who are prayers to pray for this poor family and what they're going through, because it's just a terrible situation, obviously. And the poor older brother, Chase, who has some inclination of what's going on. It's obviously terrible. But it's also not, she didn't, what happened to her didn't happen. She had these terrible headaches, and it turned out to be clots. I believe, and this had nothing to do with abortion politics. And so to make it about abortion politics is just wrong and adding onto the misery. And as you mentioned, Gracie, there's just so much misery in human life. There's so much suffering, and all too often these culture war issues, the way they play out in the media, just makes it worse. And I think I know the pro-life movement exists not to make it worse, to infuse love in this reality where there is human suffering, but also in this reality where we have, to some extent, embraced death. And yeah. So one of the reactions I noticed on Friday to the House of Commons voting for assisted suicide was this one famous retired journalist. She BBC presenter. She has lung cancer, and so she wants to kill herself when she decides it's time. And so her daughter is also a BBC presenter, and I saw her interviewed on Sky News, and she was she was positively giddy. Dappy was the word she used, because she was so excited that assisted suicide was becoming legal, and she actually said it was a birthday present for her mother, even though her mother probably won't be legal in time because House of Lords still has to vote, and for her to use it. So she's still going to have to fly to Zurich, which is her mother's plan, to kill herself there at the Dignitas clinic. But what a thing to live in a culture where a birthday present for your mom is the possibility she could kill herself legally in Britain. I mean, that's a reflection in and of itself, for us, and how we're going to, I mean, among other things. And it was interesting. This one woman, she talked in an interview about how when she talks about not being a burden, she doesn't necessarily mean that she doesn't want to be weak, but she just doesn't want the last thing for her children to see is her, gasping for air or whatever it might be. But that does kind of, I guess our obsession with being in charge, right, has something to do with this. It doesn't leave room for the mysteries of life, right? And so
I wrote a piece for National Review a couple years ago. Maybe you can link to it. Maybe
I can link to it after the fact. I cannot figure out how to share something, however.
After the fact, you can link to it. But I wrote a piece after my father died of ALS, which is one of those diseases that in a suicide culture, the day you get the diagnosis, they're signing you up for your suicide pod, for delivery of your suicide pod.
Right.
This culture, because it's that disease that is, shortly chronic, but then absolutely deadly, and it's a hard disease, very hard end. And I wrote about how thankful my family was that we didn't live in a suicide state, we didn't live in a suicide culture, because my father was so conscious of how difficult his care was for all of us that he might have been tempted.
Right.
My father was a good Christian man and a Catholic man, and he would never have done it. He had a lot of fortitude and bravery. He was very courageous to the very end, and I think I only heard him complain one time to me.
Wow.
He had a very bad episode, and was a very undignified thing happened to him. And he, mentioned, he said to me one time, he said, "Oh, this is very hard." And his eyes filled with tears. Only time I saw him.
Oh my goodness.
Complain. But the point is that we were so thankful there was no suicide. So the opposite, because we wouldn't have wanted our father to have this kind of out, when the fact is that caring for my father was such a gift. I think there are parts of my heart that didn't exist until I cared for my father like he was a baby. There were parts of my soul that were accessible to Grace for the first time because of that care and that love that I had for him. He became like my baby. That's such a beautiful, beautiful thing that God gave me. So yeah, you can take a suicide state and be excited about it because you love death, or you can choose life, even in its hardest. When life is very hard, it's only masked. It's only like covered in a hard shell. Inside, it's still the same beautiful life. You got to crack through that shell and find the blessing of life inside that shell that we reject, because it seems very hard and difficult.
And there is something to, if we reject all out the hardest sufferings, we can't even deal with the simplest.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
We become that kind of person, right?
Well, and we become that kind of culture, and that's what we're seeing. I saw someone on Twitter yesterday comment that even our weather reports kind of reflect. So we're going through a heat wave, which makes you laugh in Florida, a heat wave in the Northeast, right? And so 100 degrees, and of course now we feels like 110 degrees, and we have all that. But they call it I forget.
I saw something like apocalyptic heat wave, or like they
Yeah,
use
right,
words that
right,
are
right,
very,
right. And
it
so they
wasn't that. It
call it
wasn't
like
that, but something.
dangerous levels of heat, or that I'm using the wrong adjective.
Yeah, but it was something very scary, a very
Like
scary word.
even our weather reports add to our anxiety, you know. And I'm not dismissing the fact, especially if you're older, if you have respiratory issues. Yeah, like this is a
We don't have
serious
air
thing.
conditioning.
Sorry, if you don't have air conditioning, right? Um, yeah, this is not a joke. But at the same time, whereas it used to be, okay, we have a hot day, now there are these levels of anxiety that we're dealing with that maybe we don't, maybe we just have to make sure people have air conditioning, you know. Um,
Fortitude. We're lacking fortitude, right?
and also any kind of semblance of understanding that, yeah, like we can walk with each other in the biggest challenges and the smallest challenges and the ones in between. So,
Mm.
you know, like you said, visiting the sick, visiting an elderly home, visiting your older aunt to make sure that, you know, her air conditioning is working, and bringing her, you know, a cold, you know, whatever, Slurpee or whatever it is.
Checking in on your neighbors.
Yes, exactly. Like those things are actually part of a culture of life too.
Yeah, they are. They
um,
are.
you know, and appreciating that, and not just putting all our balls in the political court, and not just spending. I remember a number of summers ago when we had all the news about Theodore McCarrick come out, and the Pennsylvania grand jury report in a Catholic context. I remember just the sense that people were overwhelmed, and you had to be reminded that, like, this isn't the church. The church is love, and so it's like infusing the culture with love at the same time, rather than, you know, despairing of all the darkness. And I think there's something similar going on right now as we're watching these debates, and we're hearing all these horror stories. um, and I don't know if this is the right transition, but we also wanted to mention what's been going on in Nigeria, and the attack on the church in Syria over the weekend. And I know my experience of covering, particularly the genocide in Iraq 10 years ago, the ISIS genocide there. You know, people obviously writing about Christian persecution doesn't bring like traffic to your website, and people don't want to read about it. And so people occasionally will say, "Oh, you're doing a wonderful thing writing about that." And every once in a while, I have to stop someone and say, "You don't understand. I'm not a Christian. They're Christians." You know, these are people who have to make the choice, like, do I actually follow Christ or not? Almost on a daily basis. And like going to church, like, you know, I could comment. I remember one day, it was New York. It was the General Assembly for the United Nations, which is a horrific time in New York every year, traffic and otherwise. And for some reason, I thought it was a great idea to go to mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, like in the middle of it all, one morning, and go to confession too. So I'm on the confession line, which is like on the side of the altar, behind the altar, and I see these counterterrorism police patrolling, and I'm thinking, this isn't normal. And because all these world leaders are in this vicinity, they're all staying in the hotels right about around Fifth Avenue. But it did give me a moment to just pause and think, oh, there are Coptic Christians in Egypt who every Sunday, you know, they don't have counterterrorism police. They're putting their lives on their line just going to church. And my life was not in jeopardy, as the counterterrorism police officer, I think, actually was looking for a bathroom. But it was this just little moment to reflect. We are so blessed. And we have brothers and sisters. If we're Christian, we have brothers and sisters in Christ in other parts of the world whose lives literally are in danger when they go out, known to be Christian.
Yeah, it should maybe help us grow in fortitude.
Yeah. And perspective.
And perspective, and also prayerfulness, right? To pray for our brothers and sisters all over the world who don't have our freedoms. Although 2 days ago there was an attempted shooting in a church, right?
And in Michigan. Yeah.
I mean, again, there's danger everywhere. And as Christians, we have to meet it bravely. And I hope that we do, and that we accompany our Christian brothers and sisters with our prayers. It's very sad. It's very sad when we see the disorder in the Middle East, for instance, or in Africa. Oh my gosh, Africa. It doesn't bear thinking of what those poor Africans, Christians, bear. Well, again, we have to keep choosing life.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to me, you keep mentioning fortitude. And Christians, we just went through the Easter season, and then Pentecost, which is when the Holy Spirit,
where you get your fortitude.
That's where you get your fortitude, one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And so when you say grow in fortitude, you don't mean like, find some self-help book and build your fortitude. It's actually trusting God and relying on him for so many things. I know it's a silly little thing, but I remember years ago, one time in particular, it was the first time I remember doing this. This is why I bring it up. But I was on some radio show, and I didn't realize whatever I was talking about, I didn't realize that the host was hostile. Like, it's funny because, as you know, I do some media training, and so I tell people what not to do. Well, this would be an example of what not to do. You don't get on a radio show and not do some research about who the host is, so you have some clue of what's going on. But anyway, so I get on and I realize, oh, he thinks I'm a terrible person. Oh, okay. So there is at that point no plan or strategy. It was, I just said, come Holy Spirit, gonna need you now. I don't know what I just got myself into. And it actually worked out beautifully. And it was a wonderful conversation, but it was a wonderful conversation because I did not try to take control of the situation, because I had no idea what the situation was. And I think more often than not, we would be doing ourselves and others a service if we
Jesus said that, right, in the gospel. You don't think about what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit will tell you.
right. And it's said that's true about praying itself, that the Holy Spirit will do the praying for you, right? If all you can do is groan, going back to some of these suffering situations, people, there's a Dominican priest, Father James Brent, who did a beautiful video a couple of years ago about suffering. And he talked about how, like, on the hospital bed is an altar. That person can offer him or herself up completely on that altar. And what does that mean? That means just being. And to whatever extent you can offer it to God and ask God to use it. I remember my dear friend Cato Byrne, in her last week of life, she said to her, and she was a good Catholic woman her entire life, and she said to a young priest, Father, my entire life they've been telling us to offer things up. How do you actually do that? Doing exactly what you're doing, it's entering in and living in the midst of all the suffering, and like your dad, Gracie, not even complaining, except when in a human moment where he felt he couldn't take it as much as those other moments where somehow he was enveloped in such fortitude and resilience, and God bless him. It's amazing. And Gracie, because you are an example, and I'm not trying to canonize you or anything, but you and your husband Steve do try to be hospitable, and open your hearts and your home. And literally, you wrote about that beautiful woman Guadalupe, right? Who lived with you, who recently died. For people who feel like, yeah, they want to do more in the time they have left, because we all have fewer days every day, right? Um, just to be more loving, to be more hospitable. How do you do it? How do you like make the first step? Because it can be terrifying.
It's terrifying.
You don't know what you're getting into.
I you have to just jump. You have to see the need and you have to dive. And then let God take care of the rest. When Guadalupe came to live with us and we found out she was going to die with us, I was terrified, but God took care of it all. It wasn't easy.
And she was a woman who had lost her housing. She was in the process.
She was homeless.
Yeah.
Well, homeless. Homeless is a strange word. I don't mean to imply she was living under a bridge, but she had nowhere to live.
Right. She was living somewhere, and that situation unraveling.
So she came to stay with us temporarily, and then temporarily turned into permanent because she got sick and there was nowhere for her to go. She was illegal. And couldn't go back to Mexico because she was on dialysis and she would die immediately. And it became a big, complicated medical thing. But she had nowhere to go. So she's ours. God put her, God gave her to us. Like he gives you babies or other things that are a big duty, but also full of blessings. So just all I can say is just know that God's going to work it out for you. You put in your might, right? Like we put in the widow's mite, and God takes that widow's mite and he creates treasures out of it. And it's a slog and it's hard and you'll cry, but the blessings are there at the other end of the rainbow. So just keep going. You'll find them. Don't be afraid.
And in the midst,
Pope John Paul said, do not be afraid.
Oh, and then Benedict did in his inauguration, and then and Pope Leo keeps talking about courage. Pope Francis talked about it in his inauguration. Yeah, somehow, the message of Christ bears repeating. And one of the coolest things too is in the midst of making a leap of faith, so often you just see these little confirmations along the way, even as it's difficult,
completely.
God
sends you little love telegrams.
Yeah, I was going to say, the other people call it God winks, right?
Oh, okay. God winks.
I've heard that too. These little confirmations.
It's true. Anytime. Okay, we can bring it all together by saying, if you are working in the service of life, if you're choosing life, the blessings will be abundant. If you choose death, whether that's the death of generosity and hospitality or the death of suicide or the death of, if you choose death, there's nothing, there's no blessing there. There's no joy there. There's no happiness. There's only darkness. Mm-hmm. So choose the light, choose the light and do that every day in some small way. Maybe today's the day you visit that old aunt who hasn't had a visitor in 4 weeks.
Right. And who may be really grouchy and maybe yell at you when you walk in the door.
Yeah. Why haven't you been here?
Exactly.
But I'm here.
Just infuse love in that, the hurts and all of it. Mm-hmm. And this week is the 3rd anniversary of the end of Roe versus Wade, and whatever you choose to do does not have to be about abortion. It just has to be about choosing life, in whatever form, at whatever stage. And so with that, thank you, Grazie Christie, so much once again for talking about some of the matters that are weighing down our souls here in the world, but also uplifting us too. Where do we follow you on Twitter?
I'm at G Christie MD.
And I will, if you're watching this on YouTube, take a look at the little description area. I will make sure we have links to your piece on Guadalupe and to your dad.
Thank you. Such a pleasure always to be with you, Kathryn. In person or on Zoom? Always a pleasure.
Yeah, we got to figure out an in-person one soon. All right. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. And please keep coming back to nationalreview.com.